start by saying that in my presentation I will try to cover two issues. One, as Mr. Fetov mentioned this morning, I would like to give you a flavor of what we have analyzed for this year World Drug Report. I show it to you. Which is the relationship between development and drugs. And why did we do this? Because, as you know, the debate around drugs is quite polarized. And from both sides, there are a lot of slogans to really, support one or that other side. So what we do in UNODC when we try to produce research for the international community is to try to go beyond slogans and try really to look at the facts and putting together and to try to understand better the drug problem only based on scientific research. So what we did for this research, we said, really, let's look into the development. And development meant into that 5 components that you see taken from the Sustainable Development Goals. So development in terms of economic development, of social development, environmental, and in terms of partnership. And really very systematically, we look and see what is the impact of drug use and drug supply and trafficking into development, and what is the impact of development into the drug problem. And we did systematically the same, looking at the drug policy, because again, there are some that say, well, drug policies are even, they negatively affect the development of societies on one side. So we try really objectively to look at all of this relationship. Of course, in the half an hour that I have, I cannot go in the details of all of the single links that we have looked, but again, if you're interested, you can look at the report. I'll be happy to, on a side, to tell you more. So I will just give you a little bit of a flavor. So in terms of health impact, so the WHO estimates that there are, every year, drug use, the impact of drug use is 18 million of life years lost globally just for drug use, majority for opioids. So we said, okay, who is affected most by this loss? And the graph that you see on the left is looking at the different level of development by countries. The blue line, the blue that you see on the background is just the average. And you see that if we look at the data in terms of drug use, the countries with high level of income development, they have the higher burden. So they are the ones that really lose most of the years in terms of life lost. I have to caution, this is what the data tell us, but here there is a caution that is very important, that for low and medium income countries, the data is very scarce. And for particularly regions that unfortunately we don't have, in this discussion to inform, is that, for example, Africa and Asia, really the data is limited, and we really know very little on the impact that drug use has in this region. Only anecdotal information. For the anecdotal information, definitely looks like the impact is much higher. But the impact also depends on the type of drugs. And you see there on the right the case of amphetamine, for example, and you see that in a way the impact on health of amphetamine doesn't depend on the level of income of the countries. And indeed, the use of amphetamine-type stimulants around the world is really spread across all the regions. And this is one of actually the major threats that we have coming, because this is really one of the markets that is very quickly rising all over the world in all regions. You see that, for example, for cocaine, the situation is a bit different. And again, in terms of macro level, cocaine use is concentrated in richer countries. Even if when we go at sub-national level, particularly very cheap form of cocaine affect mostly the poor sector of societies, particularly, for example, in Brazil, where crack has been really spread, particularly on the lower social classes. But again, looking at the debate of legalization on who affects and the drug, who could impact on the drug use, Here are some data from Colombia that I think are very revealing in understanding, the impact on different social classes. The different colors that you see there are the red are the lower socioeconomic classes, and the blue one are the richest. And the first part on the left side is annual use. So as you know, the annual prevalence use includes recreational use and regular users. And you see that if we look at the drug use in that sense, is really dominant, and we have that the richer sector of the population is more affected. So there are more richer people who use drug in terms of annual prevalence than poor sector of the population. But when we look at actually dependence, and that is the right part of the graph, you see that is actually the opposite. So who are most the dependent people from the drug use is mostly the poor. So really what we conclude from this information is that higher social economic groups have a greater propensity to initiate drug use than lower social economic groups. But it is the lower social economic groups that pay the higher price, as they are more likely to become drug dependent. Again, this is confined to Colombia, and I don't want to claim that this is really a global finding. But this is, we don't have global data on that we can show on this. But where we have the data, I think it's important that we learn lessons like this. So in terms, again, of social and economic, we try to picture what happens in terms of the impact of drug use in development and the impact of development on drug use in terms of social and economic. And as we know, there are a lot of risk factors that leads to drug use, unemployment, lower education, migration. We have heard today about migration, and maybe we don't have the data of the recent migration, the big migration that we are experiencing in Europe. But if we go back to a few years back, for example, we interview drug users in Afghanistan, and the 40% of drug dependence in Afghanistan, told us that they initiated drug use when they were refugees in Iran. So, clearly, the migration status and the vulnerability of people that migrate and they have to leave their home, it definitely has an impact, is a risk factors for drug use. But once, people develop a drug use, what we call drug use disorders, is try to differentiate from recreational use, is to really identify and to really think that should be the core of our concern, are really those that where drug use has developed as a disorder. So, but once there is dependence, there are also additional risk factors, like injecting, that brings again even worsening the health situation. That brings a social exclusion that again reinforces what were the risk factors before, like unemployment and affecting education. Kids because of a drug dependence that cannot go to school and so on. So we call it, this is like a vicious cycle. And as we said, has been said also earlier, beyond this cycle, there are people, there are really the suffering of many people around the world. So how can we break this vicious cycle? And the first and foremost is prevention. And Yvonne described it very well earlier, so I will not go into the details. Important is that not any kind of prevention, but evidence-based prevention, preventions that we know they work. But also, once there is dependence, important to have treatment, care, rehabilitation, and again, not based on moralism or beliefs and so on, but really based on scientific evidence, things that we know they work to help a drug user to address their problem. But also, together is not only, we say and I think has been a good recognition by the international community to say drug use is not a moral issue, is not a criminal issue, is really a health issue, and we have to treat it as an health. I think what we need to also add also is that it's also an issue of social integration. It's also things that we have to look at it into overall into social policies. And so the issue of non-stigmatization and to have policies that help drug users that are not stigmatizing and are human rights based is very important. Very important to look, if we really want to look at the impact of drug into development, is to look at the gender dimension. And this is where we have global information that we can give you. We know that 1 out of 3 drug users is a woman, but only 1 out of 5 people in treatment is a woman. So that shows that release the stigmatization in terms of access to treatment of women. And maybe, I don't know if it's very apparent to maybe people in this room, but if you go to Afghanistan, if you go to Pakistan, to India, you will recognize that really drug use among women is very highly stigmatized, and not as much as stigmatized as men. So there are really impediments, barriers for women to access treatment. And what we also know, and the graphs that you see on the left, is that basically the ratio between men and women drug use. And this is from the US over the years. And the lines that are above the big, thick black line are the one where men are more likely to use drugs. And the red lines are cocaine and cannabis. And you see that, and we know. And this is for the US, but that, again, we have seen all over the world, we see the same pattern. Men are more likely to use the so-called traditional drugs, if you look at heroin, if you look at cannabis, cocaine, and so on. But women are more likely to misuse prescription drugs, and that's the blue line that you see there. And even if in the United States you see that the gender divide is decreasing, all over the world, really, we see that actually the gender divide is much higher. And particularly, even in countries where Pakistan, where it's not that there is a shortage of heroin, still women misuse prescription drugs because, again, this is less stigmatizing than the use of other drugs. But it's important to recognize these patterns because drug policy need to recognize these patterns so that they can address the specific needs of women. And so women, as I was saying, they have their own drug patterns. And so even in terms of prevention, we have seen, Yvonne mentioned the review that we have done of the preventions. And now we are reviewing this prevention research to see what we can find about boys and girls, women and men. And we saw that some prevention may work better for boys or for girls, or may work better for girls than the boys. So it's important that we recognize this specificity so that we can have a higher impact. But women are also the target of the violence, for example, the family violence, where there are drug users. And so they are the indirect victims of drug use, very often more than men. Now, to look at the drug policy and the impact that drug policy may have on development, I try to just look at one situation that is looking at the illicit cultivation of drugs. And so the map that you see there is in the Andean countries, and the red blocks that you see is where in the 60s and the 70s there were development programs, rural development programs. And the green that you see in the map is where there has been cultivation 20 years later. And you can see that there is a high correlation. That means that some of these rural development programs have been applied blindly to any drug policy. And so what they brought in some occasion is actually more coca cultivation. And we have seen it also, for example, in Afghanistan, where irrigation programs, they have benefited often more the cultivation of opium than actually helping farmers to to convert into other type of crops. So this is not to say, of course, the rural development is not a good idea by all means. But this is just to bring the point that drug development needs also to be sensitive to the drug situation of communities. So that, you know, they don't try to bring development and bring an additional problem. Now, on the converse, what is the impact of drug policy on the development of communities when we look at the cultivation of drugs? And here there is, in the report, we analyze two examples. One example is the Taliban ban that was in 2000, 2001, where, as you know, in Afghanistan, basically there was virtual zero drug cultivation, dropping drastically and then going back to high level the year after. In Nangarhar, that is one of the provinces in the southeast of the country, there has been some research done in the impact in terms of social economic impact on the farmers in Nangarhar. And that ban really brought, in a way, increased poverty among the community, because opium was the subsistence of the farmers. So in a way, that ban addressing the cultivation of drugs had a negative impact on the development of those communities. But there was another ban done by the governor of Nangarhar in 2005. This time, you know, again, basically banning and forcibly banning all farmers not to cultivate opium, but together with development programs. And so as a response to that ban, actually, there was a much more sustainable decrease of opium cultivation in Nangarhar that there was with the previous ban. And the impact on the communities was not, did not have negative consequences in terms of social economic aspect of the farmers. So again, this is to show that it's important that also drug policies are sensitive to development. And it's important that when we support communities to move, for example, here is to move to cultivation, these are really enforced together with alternative livelihood programs. Now, the other aspect that we look, and just briefly to touch upon, is the environmental impact. And again here, and I mean, it would deserve a discussion by itself, and I just to show you the impact in terms of deforestation. So if we have to say, does coca cultivation in the Andean countries has a significant impact on deforestation? I would say no, because the cultivation of coca, considering the large area under deforestation is still very small. But if we look in terms of coca cultivation, we see that about 10% of coca cultivation in the Andean countries comes from deforestation. So again, so this is important to understand, because when we have also alternative development programs to address the cultivation of coca in India, now, as Mr. Fedotov said this morning, we have also started to mainstream the issue of environment, so to make sure that drug policy are also having a positive impact on the environment. Now, not to forget, and somebody mentioned the economic, you know, we need to also look at the aspect of economics. And here, I just, again, give you a flavor, and also, again, to make the point that it is important also to consider the impact of drugs in things that maybe we don't see. Here, I just show you the Balkan route, and is the flow of opiates, of heroin, basically, generating in Afghanistan that they go to, through the Balkan route to Western Europe. And we have estimated that on average, yearly, the profits coming only from heroin is 28 billion generated through this route. And where is most money made? And most mine is made, as you can see in the bars there, is made where there are the biggest consumer market: France, United Kingdom, Germany, Italy. So that's where most of the money is made. So that's where the benefits of the traffickers are made. But the map shows the percentage of the profit in relation to GDP. And what you can see here is that the highest impact is in Afghanistan. In 2014, where that map was made, 13% of the GDP of Afghanistan is coming from the profits of heroin trafficking and production. So, this gives an idea on how important it is that you have an economy, a large part of the economy that is really that comes from, if you want, a polluted source economically. But also in Iran, which, by the way, sees about 30% of all the heroin that goes from Afghanistan to Europe, is 1.7% of the GDP is in relation to drug trafficking. But also Albania, a small country, is almost 3% of GDP. And just to give you a flavor, this percentage is higher than the percentage of rich countries give for development assistance. So just to say, to give you a flavor of the impact also that economically drug trafficking has. But there is also a big debate, and there are many people here from Latin America, and I know that in Latin America, one of the big debates is the impact of drug trafficking in terms of violence. And because sometimes I have to say at international level, they are very vocal, the Latin American countries are very vocal, there's always been these things, well, drug trafficking brings violence, so we eliminate, we legalize drugs, and then we have no violence anymore. So this is just to make the point that, the picture is a little bit more complex. And first of all, violence as considered as an apparent violence. We may have different definition of violence, but in terms of homicide, that is the most visible form of homicide, you see here, the graph shows the level of homicide by type, by the countries. And for example, the first two bars are the countries that are in the main Afghanistan opium route. And you see that the green are the countries that are not part of the route, and the red is where they are part of the route. So you see that if we look at the opiate trafficking, actually they're not causing a lot of homicides in the trafficking. The opposite is true for cocaine. You see that actually the countries that are affected by cocaine trafficking are really more affected also by violence. So I have to tell you that we have asked this question, why? Many times, and I don't want to tell you where we find the answer. I just wanted to give you a flavor of a little bit of what we have analyzed, but this is really an open research question that really deserves a lot of more research. Here, just to zoom into the Latin American countries, and what we have seen, based on data from the US, on the flow of cocaine reaching the US, coming from different countries in Latin America. Here you see, and we plot it with homicide rate. Basically, you see in the different areas that there are countries that are affected with high level of trafficking, but low violence, countries with high violence and high trafficking, and countries with high violence but no trafficking. So clearly, drug trafficking does not explain all the violence in Latin America. There are many other issues around it. But also, the question is, what is that make drug trafficking violent? And again, the explanation is complex. One thing that we looked at is the role of corruption. Traffickers don't like to operate in a violent environment. So they try to actually avoid violence. So usually it's really the last resource in order to reach their market. So maybe, and that is made true on many of the opiate route, for example, in Central Asia and so on, where actually corruption maybe play a much higher role. So you corrupt, you don't need to kill anyone. You just have the drugs going through. This is one. The rule of law, the governance around the countries, the communities that are affected by trafficking definitely have an impact. Then looking at the drug crime, again, another slogan that we have heard and that we wanted to look at the evidence, the problem of overcrowded in prison is because of the drug convention. So again, some of the argument has been, well, we legalize drugs, so we have no people in prison anymore. We have solved the problem of prison in the world. So we looked at the data. What do the data tell us? Here you see the different type of crime, the trend of different type of crime measured as the crime that come to the attention of the authority. You see a lot of crime going down globally. This is a global picture. And, and particularly is also homicide, property crime, and so on. The only two lines that you see going up is actually drug-related crime. So we tried to look into this. And I have to say, very difficult to have data. So what I'm going to tell you is really based on very few countries. But what we have seen, because then we said, okay, how does that picture translate into prisoners? And then we see, okay, well, first of all, 1/3 of prisoners around the world are still on pre-trial detention. So we don't know for why they are there, because they have not yet had a trial that could say on what offenses they are there. So this is 1/3 of the people in prison. So just to picture the idea of what does it mean to solve the problem of overcrowded in prison. Then, among those that were convicted, about 18% are held for drug-related offenses. Now, where we could find the data, and I have to say, very few countries, even countries like the United States, because of the federal and state, it's very hard to understand the different. But among this 18%, less than a quarter are held for personal consumption. So, for the little data that we have, I don't think we can say that drug users end up in prison. There are some that are in prison because of drug user offenses, but this is not really the bulk of those that are in prison. But also in terms of, again, drug policies and the impact on development of people, it's important also to recognize that imprisonment of drug offenses has an impact on people who use drugs and in the criminal justice system. And then that excessive use of imprisonment of drug-related offenses of a minor nature is ineffective. Whether we can think, I think we are the converter definitely to say that this is not the way how we want to treat people that are convicted with drug offenses of minor nature. But even if the research shows us that is ineffective. So it doesn't really help to solve the problem. And actually what the research shows that alternatives to imprisonment can have a positive impact on people who use drugs. And this is really also what basically the UNGAS document also has recognized, and you will see that member states have agreed on this. So I will very briefly now move from the issue of the general and the impact on general of drugs and development, just to talk about the current challenges, the threat that we need that we have. And so I will skip this. One is the Darknet. And if we look at the Darknet, it was mentioned also this morning. Well, the research, and also there's a latest research in Europe, in terms of the size of the drug market in the Darknet, is still small in terms of profits. So I think I've seen figures between 5% and so on. So, I mean, still is not the place where the majority of the drug trafficking is happening. But what is important is that it's very quickly increasing. So this is definitely something that we have to look at. And here it also depends. Here is a result of a global survey that is done in internet. And you see for some countries, the biggest is Sweden, for example, where 25% of the people who answered this global survey, I have to say the global survey is quite biased, it's not a representative sample, but just to have a flavor, they said they purchase drug in internet, but globally, again, is still minor. And here it shows the different type of drugs. So the Darknet seems to be a place for some type of drugs. For example, heroin still doesn't seem to be a big market in the Darknet. The other thing that I want to mention is PolyDrug User, because this is really, in a way, affecting the way how we respond to the treatment, but also to the prevention. So here is a data from the US on the PolyDrug use among heroin use in the United States. And you see that the different colors are the different other drugs that heroin user use. And you see that over the time is increasing. So the picture, of treating heroin user or cocaine user is really today is much more complicated, and particularly we see now very strongly, for example, in country like Iran, where they have a large number of people under opioid substitution treatment, where many of these people in treatment are now starting to use methamphetamine, and we see the same in Asia. So this issue of the heroin user in treatment starting to use methamphetamine in markets where this methamphetamine are becoming very easily accessible is really a concern that needs to be alerted. And the other graphs is injecting practices, again, becoming very complicated. It's not just heroin user, but also stimulants, MPS, and so on. So the picture is really blurring. I just mentioned, and there are many US colleagues that will speak a lot about, more eloquently than me about what is happening now in the United States with, and it was mentioned fentanyl. And I just wanted to give an information that for fentanyl, the United States has formally written to the Secretary General to ask for to put under international control the precursor for fentanyl. So that's maybe the information that I may bring, but I'm sure that many of you from the US can definitely talk more about this. Here, I just wanted to mention, to show you, these are the maps for the trafficking flows of heroin around the world. And again, here you see the three colors are the three markets. You know, there is the opiate generated in Afghanistan, the red, then the one generated by Myanmar, Laos, in black, and the one generated mainly from Mexico, Colombia. But what is important, and Mr. Fedotov mentioned it this morning, is that you see that the routes are more and more crossing Africa. And this, for anecdotal information that we have, is that we have a spillover effect. And these are the countries that where they have a very low capacity to address the drug problem. So the vicious cycle of marginalization that I showed you earlier and the need for these policies are weaker in Africa. And so that means that the impact of drug use and the impact in this case of drug trafficking in Africa is much higher than can be, for example, in richer countries. And this is important to recognize. Again, Mr. Fedotov mentioned again the threat in Afghanistan. You see 43% of more heroin that this year we have in the market. And what is worrying is that the price of opium is continually going up. That means that farmers are still attractive to the cultivation of opium, but also means that there is still demand. So heroin is not an old, is not dead in the sense. So we still need to look at heroin as a concern for the world, and particularly in countries where we don't have data, China, India, where we really don't know the scale of the problem. Then here is just to show you, but I'm sure John Hawkins will discuss much more eloquently than me the impact and what it means, the impact of the new policies in the US. But what I wanted to show you here is the cocaine, that again also the production of cocaine is increasing, particularly in Colombia. And here I wanted to show you the map of the cocaine flows, just to make the point that where the markets are growing is where we have an increase of affluent sector of the society, particularly in Asia. And where, again, if you talk to the law enforcement in Asia, they still see as their main problem heroin and methamphetamine. So sometimes they're not even able to recognize cocaine. And this is where in Africa, in Asia, is where also the price of cocaine is particularly attractive for trafficking. So this is an area where definitely there could be an expansion. And now, this is an area that, again, just to bring the concern of other regions that maybe they are not here, is that, and I don't know if you have heard of the Captadin, but Captadin is an amphetamine that is used in the Gulf country and in the Middle East, is a stimulant. It became to the attention of the media recently because the terrorists of the Paris attack were under the influence of Captadin. And so suddenly, you know, the world media got attention, while Captadin is a phenomenon that is quite old in the Middle East and the Gulf countries. But what I wanted to show you there is that there is a lot of trafficking coming from Syria and around. And we don't have factual information to point that ISIL is producing Captagon, but there are a lot of anecdotal, and the issue that definitely this, because it's quite easy to manufacture. So this could be, is a concern, yes, this is a concern because it's potentially also a source for terrorism. The last, because, but again, I'm sure many, I'm sure EMCDA would mention, is the new psychoactive substances. And here, just to give you the flavor of the type, and the different colors in the squares are the type of MPS that is very different. But what I wanted to address is the question that I think you asked this morning to Mr. Fedotov, is, first of all, not all MPS remain in the market. By the end of this year, we have about 750 substances, new substances. But not all remain. They come and go. The current convention control actually has embedded, they have embedded a system to respond quickly to the control globally of substances. So there is a way to address even with the current legal system. With this, I close and I thank you.